Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Kaufman, and I'm a poet and a PhD candidate in Latin American and Jewish history at UCLA. When Teo Ruiz suggested this event last year, and when Grzegorz and I began planning over the summer with Sarah Stein and Chelsea White, Vivian Holenbeck, and David Wu, which is also my way of thanking all of you and thanking the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies for making this event possible. When we were all planning this event, we had no idea what magnitude of devastating violence would and could exist in the world at this time. The traumatic violence of October 7th in Israel and its continuing aftermaths, and the ongoing catastrophe in Gaza and violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. For me, it feels and has felt both more pressing and also somehow insufficient to shelter in poetry. And I hope we'll dwell inside of this tension together today. Before I introduce our incredible guest, I want to read a short poem by Ilya Kaminsky, Ukrainian poet, which sits inside some of these discomforts and I think can set the scene for our reading and discussion today. The poem is entitled, "We Lived Happily During the War." We lived happily during the war. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. I hope this event can serve for us at once as a call to action to seize cycles of violence, as a space for mourning, and as a moment of reckoning and recognition in which we can dwell in the capabilities and the powers, as well as the limitations of the poetic line in the face of violence. So with that, I'll introduce our amazing poet and musician guest, Grzegorz Kwiatkowski, whose work sits at the edges of language's capabilities. He is a Polish poet and musician, a member of the Polish psychedelic rock band Trupa Trupa, and is the author of several books of poetry focusing on history, remembrance, violence, and ethics. We'll be focusing mostly today on his poetry book, Crops, published in 2021, translated by Peter Constantine, which writes from the viewpoints of victims, survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders during and after the Shoah in Poland. Volumes of his poetry have appeared in English, French, German, Slovene, and Greek, and translations of his poems have been published in British and US literary and cultural magazines, including Modern Poetry in Translation, World Literature Today, The Guardian, and New Poetry in Translation, amongst many other venues. He is a member of PEN America and the European poetry platform Versopolis. And very relevantly, he co-hosts the workshop Virus of Hate at the University of Oxford and is taking part in the Surviving Memory in Postwar El Salvador, a collaborative research initiative. I'll turn things over to Grzegorz to read us some of his poems, and then we'll have a short discussion followed by a Q&A with the audience. Please feel free to put any comments and questions in the chat as we go along. Thank you, Grzegorz. Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for this great introduction. And dear Theo, dear Rachel, dear David, dear Chelsea, thank you for organizing this event. What can I say? I mean, these are most difficult circumstances for such conversation, and in some way, it tests, you know, these abilities of poetic language in a biggest way. I mean, what we can do with a poetic language and poetic words and literature in such tragic circumstances. So on one hand, I'm devastated. On the second hand, I'm very happy that we are creating some community, and I think it's, you know, for me it's immediate support. I'm very thankful for this great poem by Ilya Kaminsky, who is a really great poem, especially for such times. But he's just a great poet. I would like also to say about Rachel Kaufman and her great book, Many to Remember. I was just reading it one more time before this event, and I thought, oh my God, Rachel knows how to deal with this stuff in the best way. So maybe this conversation should be mainly I should ask Rachel about her methodology of writing about atrocities and Holocaust and genocide and about cruelty, because she's doing it in a brilliant way. Without in poetry of Rachel, you can see some parts of a violent scenery, but it's, you know, it's almost invisible. I mean, and that's the point, that she's doing it not in a direct way, and I think that's why it's very successful. And I'm doing it in a bit different way. So I know that beginning of this conversation with saying that my book is a failure is a bad idea. But well, I feel really in some way defeated in spiritual way because of war in Israel. Yeah, so I will read for you a few poems from a book called Crops, and yeah, and then let's talk. Let's try to talk. Crops. Our real work is farm work, not killing. Although I admit the massacres in the swamps have the rhythm of our seasonal labor, and when the rains were heavy, we did not go out for crops. Ranger dance. During the war, we laid out bodies like wood, but after the war, we laid out wood in the forest like bodies freshly felled. World. I went with my child to the forest and cried helplessly with him. Tears dripped from my eyes, and the child wiped them away with his hand, and I so regretted that I had brought him into the world. Walter Stier. My father, a decent office worker in the railways, never took part in any of the shootings. He was just doing his job, organizing transports, eastward and westward, north and south, back and forth. Karl-Heinz M. I was 14 years old. I was sterilized because I couldn't tell the difference between a brook and a stream, between steps and stairs. Szymon Srebrnik. I didn't believe I would return to Poland ever again, to Chełmno, and that I would stand where they killed me. No, no, no. Ernst Junger. War has let me down. Modern war has not met my expectations. It didn't live up to its literary ideal. For example, there were no horses. Thank you. And let's talk.
Thank you. It's hard to begin talking after your poems dwell in silence, demand silence. I think that's why I and so many people, some of whom I know are in the audience, find your work so moving, is that violence is embedded in the form, embedded in the structure of the poems. It lies bare on the surface. I have questions about that, but I might start with a question that goes back to the beginning, which is crops emerged from your encounter with a grim and unmarked and monstrous sight of shoes outside the Stuttgart concentration camp, where your grandfather had been interned during World War II. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your family history, about this encounter, the affective experience of the encounter, and mostly why this intimate, startling brush with violence found its way specifically to poetry. Why did poetry feel like the right medium, and why do you feel it's important to write these poems that live so viscerally within the realm of violence?
Yeah, the story of my poetry is really a story of my family roots, and it's the story of my family. And I didn't choose to write about violence. I just wrote about family. So in some way, these poems are like, you know, very dark fairy tales, but of course they are real. But the point is that my grandfather was a prisoner of a concentration camp Stutthof. His sister too. He was a broken man with trauma, devastated man after the Second World War. His sister was, after the war, she was mentally ill because so it affected her even in a bigger way. And when I was it wasn't a secret that he was a prisoner. But when I was a child, my grandfather took me to the museum of a concentration camp Stutthof, and we visited this place, and it was his first visit after the Second World War. And when he went to this museum, he started to shout, scream, and cry, because suddenly he was back. Then he was back in this hell during the Second World War. So and I was observing it, and I didn't know what to do, what is going on in some way. So I just started to ask myself, you know, simple and most hard question, you know, why people are building concentration camp, why people are killing each other, why people are torturing each other, why my grandfather was a prisoner of a concentration camp, etc., etc. And I think that it showed me, I think these questions were most important questions for me, and they are most important till now, because sometimes I know why, for example, why people are killing each other, but then I'm thinking that I don't know. You know, for example, now we've got this tragic and awful war in Israel, and every day I'm thinking in a different way, and I really don't know. Well, I know what to think, but but on the other hand, I'm thinking in a different way, and uh, so it was one thing. The second thing is that I was a musician. I was going to the musical school. I was playing on the clarinet and saxophone, and I loved music. I loved Schubert, Mozart, Brahms, Beethoven, Wagner, and till now I love them, even Wagner. But of course, this love is very complicated because of his anti-Semitism. I think that the world of cruel violence history mixed in my life with a melody, with art, with music, in a very natural way. And then I was a coordinator of Amnesty International in the city of Gdańsk for a few years. So I knew that, you know, that human rights are violated were violated not only during the Second World War, but it was happening all the time, more or less. Then I started to write to write poetry, but I didn't want to write about history from the very beginning. Firstly, I wanted to write in a, you know, in the style of Robert Lowell or Allen Ginsberg, or, you know, kind of a bohemian style from 60s and 70s. Of course, I was teenager, but then I understood that I'm writing in most successful way. In some way, I'm writing about myself. So I'm writing about history and about my family. So my life is very, very connected to the history. For me, the history is not the past; it's just happening all the time, all around. Unfortunately, and firstly, I was writing because I thought it will be a cure for myself. It was like a self-therapy. But then, in some way, I found the way to the readers, and then I heard from them that it helps them mm, to cure in some way. It works for them like a cure. So it was for me very, very, very great thing, and I was happy that I'm making something which is not which is helping and not destroying. And that's the point of my poetry. I mean that I very often say about more moral light idea, because I'm not writing about genocide, Holocaust, and violence just to show you these cruel images, but I'm trying to write about it to in some way to take a reader to these histories where there are not good answers, and the reader is in a trap, is in a moral trap. And I think that this moral trap works like a situation in which your moral apparatus, which can be turned off, suddenly can be turned on, and then you're starting to ask yourself these most important questions. But it's not only about the past and about remembering the past, which is very important, but I think it's also about yourself. So I think that this poetry about violence should also work in the way like, you should just look at the mirror and you should think, what would I do in the wartime? What would I do if I would be a person who could help someone, or maybe I would be a murderer. And what is most important, if we could ask ourselves a question, if I'm a good person, and what can I change for others here and now, not only in the historical way, but am I a good father? Am I a good husband? Am I a good worker, poet, etc.? So I think that my poetry is mostly about not even a history, but about morality. So it's not about violence. I mean that I'm writing about violence because it happened. So we need to know that it happened, in my opinion. But I think it's all about trying to be better person, and especially right now, when we've got super right wing, far right wing politicians all around the world, which are bigger and bigger. I think it's super important to fight in a pacifistic way, fight with a poetry.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And I'm sorry because I didn't say about shoes. So very, very quickly, a few years ago, I found with my friend almost 500,000 pairs of shoes near the fence of the Stutthof concentration camp. The Stutthof was a Leve reparation center for all concentration camps in Europe. So mainly shoes from Auschwitz were transported to Stutthof, and they were numbered in 1945 when Red Army liberated the camp. In 1967, when the museum was established, most of the shoes were just thrown to the forest like a trash. And me and my friends started we found this, thousands, tens of thousands of shoes, and we tried to secure them because they are real artifacts of genocide and Holocaust. But so we fight it with a mechanism of not remembering. And but the Museum of Stutthof concentration camp wasn't interested in protecting these artifacts of genocide. They told us that it's got no historical value, and it was a very shocking thing. So in some way, we are still fighting for this thing, and it's also connected to my poetry, but because it showed me that there are a lot of things we can do and we can try to change.
Thank you. I think one of the most startling parts of your work is that you're in some way resuscitating or partially resuscitating the voices of victims or of those who were oppressed or of the owner of the shoes, but you're putting those voices right next to the voices of bystanders and perpetrators, and voices of evil, as you've talked about it. And I think the idea that the history is not past, is not the past, and is not past makes it so your poetry feels very truthful. The past is living in the present, feels very reflective. The fact that you said that your poetry could be a mirror, is a mirror to the reader, a place where there's no good answer, a moral trap. It's not only a means to relive, but it's not really a reliving. It's just a continual living, which I find really powerful. And I wanted to ask, because you're also a musician, and I have a background in music too, so I think about this. And because we're thinking about sort of the limits of poetry and the impossible, I wanted to ask you about how you think about silence in your work, which is also a way of saying how you think about silence and sound, and how each holds the past, how they hold the past together. I wrote down a line from Paul Celan as I was reading your work, and thinking about how some of history refuses translation. There are these silence that seem to persist, and the poet can pick up on those silence, reflect those silences, have silence be some sort of mirror. And his line is, "When the silent one comes and beheads the tulips, who wins? Who loses? Who walks to the window? Who's the first to speak her name?" And I think this question of who wins, who loses is a very relevant question amidst cycles of violence like the ones we're in now. But also this question, who will be the one to reckon, to speak, to remember, to speak in the face of the impossible, in the face of silence. And then poetry is a very specific kind of speaking, in that silence is as much in the act of speaking as sound. So I'd love to hear how you think about that.
Well, I'm also a musician. You're right, and sometimes in Trupa Trupa music there are parts focused on Holocaust, on Shoah, and on the lack of memory, or on mechanism of denialism. But I think that the silence is very, in some way, my poems are very little, very minimalistic, and very, very, very short, and they are almost invisible. But the point is that in some way I'm fighting with silence. I mean that I think we shouldn't treat this Holocaust and genocide topic with the atmosphere of silence and some sacred atmosphere. I mean that I think we should try to speak, even if it's hard to speak, and we should find the ways how to speak and how to communicate. And I think that Paul Celan, of course, was a brilliant poet, and I love his poetry, but I'm also thinking about communication and educational aspects. And I think that Paul Celan is, this is brilliant literature, and I will not criticize him. I'm not a madman, but I think that by reading Paul Celan, we are in the middle of suffering in some way. But sometimes when I'm reading literature, I would like to learn something. You know what I mean? I would like to learn something about biographies of people who died, about victims, about murderers, about perpetrators. And that's why, for example, I'm closer to American poet Edgar Lee Masters and his Spoon River anthology, or I'm closer to Walt Whitman poetry, because I would like in some way to speak in a very open, clean and clear way about atrocities without atmosphere of something incredible. And I think that by writing about such cruelty, violence, and Holocaust, when I'm writing about Holocaust in a very neutral, normal way, like it would be a normal thing, like it's a normal thing. It's a regular normal thing, like a everyday landscape. I think that's the point when the reader is shocked. I mean that why and I'm using it not in a cynical way. By the way, most of my voices are real voices of real people. So most of the murderers talked about their acts in this neutral, normal way, which is of course shocking, and it's shocking for me. It's not, I didn't used to it, but I think that it works. I mean that if you will picture Holocaust in a naive, normal, everyday way, then someone can wake up and protest in the way, what are you doing? Why are you, writing about it in such way? It really happened. It was much more complicated. It was more shocking. It was much more emotional. And of course, I know about it. But in some way, I would like to really wake up, not only the others, but also wake up myself. For example, now I'm father of two sons. Franz Leve, 5 years old, and Joseph Isaac, 3 months old. And this is a very strange mixture in the way, in my house, that the atmosphere is like, we've got Christmas time every day, it's like a pure joy and harmony. And on the other hand, I watch the news and I see these pictures, and, it's something super schizophrenic for me. I mean, that I can't stand it, but I don't know if these pictures of media outlets are putting in my face of dead bodies and dead babies is the answer for my moral apparatus. Of course, it's a shocking in a very fast way, immediate way. I mean that I'm shocked, I'm devastated. I mean that, but there is no space for an action really. I mean it's no or yes and no situation. I mean that it's very it's like a big emotional chantage, you know what I mean? And it's very, I'm not saying that all media outlets are cynical, and I'm not saying that everyone is doing it in a bad way. Of course, we should report it and we should spreading this awful news. But I think that now the cruelty and violence is, as you said before we start the discussion, weaponized. It's like a weapon. It's like these pictures of dead people are like it's like a machine gun with pictures of dead people, and they are just hitting you, and you have to say, for example, I hate Israel, what I mean, that yes, of course, or I hate Palestinians, in very direct way, and I think that it's all much more complicated, and also that's why in my poetry there are many voices. There is no one kind of a language, but there are many kind of languages and many voices and many perspectives. And I think if you want to think about it, you should have many perspectives. And now I can see in the media world one big polarization. So for example, it's not an answer for me. I mean that it doesn't work for my moral apparatus.
It does seem like a new way to think about poetry, that it's the answer for a moral apparatus through its normalcy, not through the Poetics is actually just relaying very simple, reflective language. The idea that normalcy is the means to creating shock is very striking. And I don't think I've read work like yours before that employs that starkness as a means to ethical reckoning. And it maybe has to do with rhythm. Talked about silence as a musician, but it maybe has to do with the rhythms too, which I'm sure are deeply ingrained in your body. And
I think you're right. I mean that all literature and poetry is about rhythm and about music. I mean, it's not only about the story, history, and the importance, because I know a lot of in some way great important I know a lot of books about very important things which are bad books because they are written in a bad way. Of course, it's all about music. I totally agree.
Yeah, and especially
I'm sorry. We of course the it makes this thing a bit perversive. I mean that there is a music about Holocaust. This is a very strange combination. I mean that I'm sure that there are people who think it's too much, but this is the way I feel I should share this story. But I think that there are of course people who thinks that it's too much in their face. Exactly the same as I said 5 minutes ago about media outlets. Maybe someone could say the same about my poetry, that it's too much in his face, etc. But I think that the context is important, right? So I think we are still in the world of poetry. We're not it's not the world of mass information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about with rhythm, specifically the poem you read, Ranger Dance, because of its cyclicality, its sparseness, its repetition, the relentlessness of the rhythm, which I think echoes it creates a sense of normalcy, and it refuses to let the reader go in some way. And like many of your other poems, the poem refuses to arrive far beyond where it began, which I think is a reenacting of violence. It's that call for ethical, for a moral reckoning. I wanted to ask, we have a few questions in the chat. I'll ask maybe one more question and then turn to those. No, I'll ask two. One based on what you were just saying. Someone asked me recently, I was talking about violence, poetry holding history. I have a side question, which I won't ask, which is where the voices come from, sort of archival question, the voices you're taking. Take any of these questions or leave others behind. So one question is about where the voices come from, where you find them. The other question that this person asked me is, does any reader ever sit down to a poem and not expect beauty in some way, expect some sort of experience of transcendence or escape or affective pleasure, even if it's a dark poem about the rhythm is relentless, even if, and I don't have an answer. So I'm wondering if you have an answer to that question about the inescapability of beauty, if it can live at the same time, if the poem can escape beauty. It has to do with these tensions you're talking about of normalcy and shock. And
these are very hard questions. I mean, the first one is not hard, but I'm the source of this poetry are, I told about family history. There is also a family history of my wife, because my wife she's a Jewish and her family is a Jewish family. But this is the story of hiding in the forest. Her grandmother was hiding as a child near the city of Rzeszów, or exactly Mielec, during the Second World War. But it was a family secret, and I asked a few years ago on the birthday party grandmother of my wife, what were you doing during the Second World War? And she told me, of course I was hiding in the forest. And I asked, why? And she said, because it was World War. Everyone in Poland was hiding in the forest. So I said, well, no, I don't think so. And I asked her if she's a Jewish person, and she's told me, no, I'm not a Jewish. I hate Jewish people. When I was a child, I saw 2 Jewish boys who stole a Holy Communion from the church, and they took it in the middle and they crushed it. And I said, I know the story. It's a story from the Middle Ages. It's a poem story. And it was the end of the conversation. It was very, very nervous atmosphere. And it was her birthday party. So it was a really big faux pas from my side. But the point is that there is also a story of my wife who claimed for years that she didn't know about her Jewish roots. And after this discovery, she said that she didn't know. And now she can tell me that of course she knew, everyone knew, but it was so big secret that even her husband didn't know about it. And now she's reconnected with the Jewish culture. She bought a mezuzah to our house, and our second son has got a Jewish Isaac name. So, but it's also a story about my family. I mean, it's a story about fear. For example, these events in Israel, it's a bad word, but this tragedy in Israel also affected in some way, even here even my family in Poland, because my wife asked me, not in a direct way, but she asked me that maybe it's time that I should not speak publicly about their Jewish heritage and roots, because they are starting to being afraid. And so it was a shocking thing for me. And of course, the sources of voices are from testimonies, afterward testimonies from from Shoah by Claude Lanzmann, from many documentary movies, from stories of my grandfather. There are a lot of sources, but the point is the musicality of it. You're right. I mean, the point is the rhythm. I mean, it's always the same. That I need a melody. I need the music. To preserve it. I need a musical moment to preserve the history to the world of the poetry. So it's always like that. And about the second question, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I can give you an answer. I know how the poetry works on me, and well, it's always a mixture of cruelty and beauty, but of I wouldn't think about poetry or poetry about violence and cruelty as something like masochistic or something which is a pleasure. I mean, for me, cruelty and violence always was something that I rejected. You know what I mean? It wasn't the cruelty and violence isn't a fascinating thing for me. I'm afraid of violence, so it's not about that. Wow, this is great or it's amazing, and the rhythm is so great. I mean, that I'm really afraid. In some way, I'm afraid of human beings, and I'm also afraid of violence. But the point also, I think that the big point of my life and my poetry is that I'm also in some way not trusting to myself. So I'm afraid of my abilities to being a bad guy. That's the point. So I know that I can also be this bad character in the story. And I'm asking every day this question to myself: am I a good person? And of course, the answer is no. And I'm trying to be a better person every day. Yeah. And poetry helps me. And maybe the most important thing, which I know that we're running out of time, but the literature in general, the art, movies, I mean, the music, the Mozart, Thomas Mann, the Magic Mountain, it works for me. The whole art works for me like a moral apparatus. When I read great book, it always shows me something about me, and it's always showing something bad about me, and it always shows me the way how can I improve. And for me, this moral enlightenment is most interesting in the art. When I'm listening to Magic Flute, I'm fascinated. This is the pure harmony, and I love it. But it's also about me, about my dirty state of spirits.
Yeah, thank you. I found it to be an impossible question, but that helps. The idea that music acts to preserve. It is hard to escape some sort of beauty when we're thinking about rhythm and music and melody, but there is sort of an incantatory, especially when you're reading, a sort of intoning. It reminded me of medieval chants as you read. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to merge a question from Spencer Pennington, and then I'll go to the other two questions with the last question I was going to ask, and then I'll go to the others. Spencer says, thank you to both of us. Thank you for your beautiful and haunting poetry and commentary. This has been forcing to mind Dr. Teo Ruiz's book, The Terror of History, and its haunting comments on the late Walter Benjamin. My question is, given the violence out of which this poetry was born, how do those of us who turn to poetry and music for solace utilize this medium for horrors still unfolding? How do we use poetry and music or find solace in it if we see darker days on the horizon in the short term, thanks to the continued ascent of the far right, for instance? Which was related to, I'll blend that with one of my questions, which was, you're writing poetry in the aftermath of violence as a means to enact this mirror, this marking, reckoning, to preserve memory. So I'm along the lines of Spencer's question, what is the role of poetry during violence, during mass violence? Thinking about your work too on hate, at Oxford, and your work on memory in El Salvador, which we probably don't have time to get into it, but I'm interested in that, the ways memories of violence across communities can bolster one another, can create space for collective grieving and action. So poetry in the moment of violence, as opposed to afterwards.
Well, if I understand properly, I mean, so what is the role of poetry in the time of violence? This is this direct question, or I misunderstood it?
Yeah, as opposed to writing poetry afterwards, what's the role of poetry in the present moment of violence? Spencer's asking, when we turn to poetry for solace, what do we do in a very dark time with poems?
Well, you know, we are. I'm keep going. You know, we are not giving up. I can only say about myself. I mean, I'm not giving up. And when the dark times are really super dark, I'm just working harder. I mean, uh, for in some way the future, and luckily, because the Poland in some way, not in some way, this is a dark place, but actually, for example, the democratic opposition just won the elections a few weeks ago, and we are turning into European Union values and direction. And for example, I was protesting with my friends and appealing for years to commemorate the forgotten Jewish ghetto in the city center in the center of Gdańsk, because I'm from Gdańsk. And after years of battle, City Hall decided that they will commemorate this forgotten Jewish ghetto, and it will be commemorated tomorrow, for example. So there are good things that are happening, and especially in Poland, which is very surprising. I mean, it's really surprising. So because I was always giving a comments about Poland, you know, I was always saying the truth, but for 8 years we had a far right wing president and far right wing government. So and the anti-Semitism was rising. So now it changed a bit, but it's also connected to the poetry because, you know, for me poetry is not an isolated thing. I mean, you know, for example, I think that this event shows it, but I had a lot of discussions, and I've got workshops in Oxford and many different activities, and we are discussing them there. A lot of violent events in history and nowadays, and we are using we are trying to fight with it with an art. I mean that it's not a, for me, art and beauty, I didn't say about earlier, is also a hope. No, I mean, I didn't say about it earlier, but when I'm listening to Glenn Gould or when I'm listening to Bach, I know that we can be better. You know what I mean? And I think this is the same with poetry. Maybe not my poetry. Now I'm thinking that maybe not with my poetry, but with Rachel poetry for sure. I mean that when we are reading Rilke, that we know that there is something better inside of us, and we can try to go in this direction. So different, because my poetry is trying to say to us, please look inside of you and find an evil, because you have to fight with this evil. So the role of my poetry is really different, but most of poetry is really appealing to this great side of humanity. And I think of art is super important in dark times. And you know, during in the ghetto, in the Warsaw ghetto, you know, people were writing poems and making a theatrical spectacles and making a music and everything really. And you know, Janusz Korczak was creating a lot of entertainment for his kids, to give them hope, of course. So I think that, of course, Janusz Korczak wouldn't use my poetry in Warsaw Ghetto, but I guess that my poetry rather works in a bigger way in the times not in of violence, but in the time of not remembering. I think that this is a time for my poetry is a time when people don't want to hear about history, don't want to hear about violence, and they just think that everything is perfectly fine if the bombs are not, you know, landing on your head. But the point is that cruelty and violent historical events are happening really all the time, and this is the most horrifying thing, that the war in Israel is one of the wars. It's not the only one. You know, we've got a war on Ukraine, and we've got a lot of awful big conflicts every year by year, more and more. So it's happening all the time.
Related to, you answered some of it already about Poland, but someone asked, how is the Middle East war being discussed in Poland, and how, if at all, has it affected attitudes towards Jewish people?
Yeah, I think this is a very strange time for Poland. I mean, that because this is for sure still anti-Semitic country, but now in a very strange way. I mean that now the level of anti-Semitism in the different countries is bigger than even in Poland. You know what I mean? Which is very tragic. And it says, for example, in Germany, in France, in Great Britain. So in some strange, this is a very strange situation when Jewish community is feeling safer here, for example, than in France. I'm pretty sure about that. But of course, you know, for example, most of my friends from the left side oriented. Of course, I'm also left side oriented, but you know, they're saying all the time about Gaza and Palestine, but they will not say a word Hamas. You know what I mean? They will not condemn Hamas. They don't touch it. Which for me is very cynical, and which for me, in some way, it's act of anti-Semitism. So if someone can't relate to massacre of Hamas and is not mentioning about it, I think it means something. So unfortunately, this anti-Semitism is still high, but I guess it's not so high and aggressive and violent as in the different parts of the world, which is a really, I mean, that Poland is a really in a very surprising moment. And I'm normally I'm rather more pessimistic, but now I see really a hope in this country. You know, almost 80% of people, 80% took a part in elections. This is a so and we chose democracy. So I think this is amazing. And I'm talking about it from Gdańsk because in Gdańsk the Second World War started, but also in Gdańsk the Solidarity Worker Movement started, and Solidarity movement crushed the communism era in Central Europe. And so I've got a hope. Normally I don't have this kind of amounts of hope, but now I've got a hope for change, and maybe this change and hope will also come from Poland. And as I said earlier, tomorrow there will be a commemoration of Jewish ghetto in Gdańsk. The city hall, the mayor of Gdańsk, president of Gdańsk will do it. You know, it's very moving. I mean, it's very. I'm very happy because of that. And I think this is the first step to commemorate Jewish community of Gdańsk. This is only the first step. I'm dreaming about Stolpersteins in Gdańsk, but about many things. But so I think that the state, dear Sandy, because this question was asked by my great friend from UCLA too, Sandy, and yeah, I think it's not the worst place really. So please feel invited, all of you, to Gdańsk, Poland.
I'm glad you got my closing question, which we won't get to quite yet, was about hope. I'm glad you got there before me. That's a hopeful thing. I'll ask something maybe about solidarity, but I'll just read. Someone said, is that a Beatles poster over your left shoulder?
Yeah, this is a Beatles poster, but I can show it's a Beatles poster. But actually, to say something more about me, this is a Beatles poster, but we can see also here this gentleman, of course, is Franz Kafka. So for sure he's not a part of the Beatles. But yeah, this is a Beatles poster, and that's the point. I mean, that the music, the Beatles, you know, they are all giving hope. I mean, when you're listening to the Beatles, you know, you're not giving up. it's getting better all the time. I know it can sound very paradoxical, cynical, and very bad, but I think that we can't give up, especially in such times. And I know that it's easy for me to say about that because I didn't lost my family in Hamas attacks or in Gaza, so I know I've got big privilege to speak about it without suffering. But I have my amount. I have my amount of suffering from the past. So maybe I've got something to say. And what I wanted to say is not only about our ability to murder each other, but it's about not giving up and about building communities and about believing in art and beauty and humankind, better future of humankind. So I know that there is a big threat that Donald Trump will be another president of US. So maybe the troubles will be even bigger and bigger. I hope not. But I think also that we really should know about one thing, that the biggest dream of every politician is to polarize us in the most possible way. So I think we should really try to communicate, even if people from right-wing territory, or even people who support Donald Trump. I know it's super hard, of course. I know it's super hard, but if we'll stop communication in very paradoxical way, this is a win-win situation for both sides. I mean, for both political side, but not for human beings, for sure.
Yeah, the glimpses of hope that I've noticed in the past couple of months have been the moments where people are, you said, I have, some grief, enough grief that maybe I can relate to what's happening or have something to say, or and those moments when people have been not weaponizing, as we talked about earlier, grief, but utilizing grief to try to prevent further grief for other people. And this was what I was thinking about when I mentioned your work on global memory. You're thinking about memory of violence across places, and this way that that grief can make room for collective grief, or for solidarity, or for collective action, for community, which seems very close to what you're saying about hope.
Yeah. I think that we need hope, but we also, during these super dark times, even right now, I'm taking notes, for example, from this super obscene conversation from WhatsApp. I mean, from October 7th massacre. So some messages sent by Hamas to their families about killing Jewish people, and I'm still taking notes, and I'm sure there will be a time to discuss these things in a less polarized atmosphere, because now I think it's impossible, but I think it's now we're in the middle of it. But I'm sure that the poetry has got something to say about also this situation, and I'm sure that poetry can also in some way take an action in prevention of such acts. I know that I sound like a crazy person, but I really believe in the power of poetry, totally.
Mm-hmm. I think we wouldn't be dedicating our lives to it if we didn't think it could actually mobilize some change. And I think your work's a beautiful example of poetry that can startle people awake into enacting change.
Thank you, dear Rachel, but I'm really, it's not a contradiction, but your book, Many to Remember, I'm in your fan, I'm psyched, and this is an amazing book. I mean, it's amazing. So you're preserving memory in a great way, in a different way than me, but I prefer your way.
Thank you. That's very kind. I think we need all of these different reckonings of the past.
Yeah. Yes, you're right.
I don't know if you want to close with a poem.
Why not? I mean, yes. I'm searching for something which is not so. I'm searching something with hope, but I've got a problem. Okay, I've got something. All right. I found something. It's like an anti-death statement. All right. Decree. The president of the state of S, at the instigation of myriad citizens, issued a decree annulling death. From one day to the next, the cemeteries were transformed into verdant parks, and hospices and hospitals into kindergartens. We stand on the market square of one of the towns of S, watching the faces of the townsfolk. We see no fear, no trace of sleepless night. Someone has written on the nearby wall, innocent sunsets. I found something.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, your clarity, your rhythms, melodies. I'm sure everyone here is very thankful to have had this glimmer of hope. So thank you.
Thank you, dear Rachel. Thank you, dear UCLA. Thank you, dear Tio. You are all amazing, and I was very, very privileged to be here. Thank you, dear Scarlett. I see Scarlett front. Great. So I'm very, very, very happy, very touched, and we shouldn't believe politicians. Really, we should try to think by ourselves. I know it's very hard, but yeah, please don't do that.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.